Part 3. The first emergence of the Wendigo. Encounters. For many, the dire events of the past 11 years will have had a deeply personal impact upon them. They will know what occurred in the nearby area and may have received rumors of goings-on in other parts. They could have lived nomadic lives, journeying from place to place and searching for safety. It is doubtful that many are in possession of all the facts. Thanks to the forming of the Reunified States National Intelligence Agency in 1876, President Grant and myself were able to dispatch agents and information gatherers to every corner of the nation, to compile as complete as possible an archive of materials detailing the history of the outbreak. The following passages are merely a sample of the assembled archive, but do at least paint a picture of what beset us at the time, how it spread, and how we responded as a people. The word ghoul here is used by this civilian to describe the Wendigo. We have chosen not to alter her words to better reflect the feeling of the time. The following is a transcript of this individual's account.
Maggie Strother, Charlottesville, Virginia, October 3rd, 1877. It would have been in early spring of '72 when I first set my eyes on a ghoul. Everybody living, I'd imagine, has a memory of their initial encounter, but back then we were the first to bear witness, and had no one else to commune with regarding their behavior. I thought it simply a savage or a nigger, wild with hunger, and indeed the sight of his body so contorted and frantic chilled my very blood. I was born in Mississippi in 1806, and so was no stranger to vile things and disorders of the mind and body. But something seemed especially odd with this one. I remember clearly the setting sun was just touching the far end of the riverbank, and everything was orange and shadows. He come running out the woods, clothing hanging off him like he didn't know it was there, or at least was refusing to acknowledge it. I sat up on my porch and looked at my gun. Our part of the country had near emptied of Negro folk over the last 10 years, and so if there was to be an uprising, at least it would only be a small one at first. We would have time for reprisal. The ghoul turned and started sniffing the air, sniffing like an old jackrabbit. Must have smelled something he thought would either be a danger to his person or a tasty morsel. Possibly both. He turned away from me and started creeping in the back of the Henshaw house. I quietly got up off my porch, bringing my gun with me, trying to see what he was up to. As I stood, I figured what he had smelled. They were cooking up a stew for their supper, and it looked like this fellow was very much in the mood for stew this evening. I heard a crunch and saw the Henshaw back door give way. I hollered out for help and moved round to the backyard as fast as my leg would permit me. There were screams and the sound of breaking crockery. I poked my head in the back door and saw Bill Henshaw cradling his wife's head in his hands. They were on the floor, and the table was flung back. A cooking pot sat on its side in the corner, with stew steaming on the boards. Across the lower half of her body was the twitching form of this ghoul. Its neck had been cut like a hog's, and copious quantities of blood had soaked into the front of her dress. I could see vicious bite marks at Helen's throat, and she was whimpering and sobbing. Bill, his arms soaked in blood, was holding a towel to her wounds and dabbing at them. The rest of the neighbors arrived over the next few minutes, and we dared move the dead nigger, which was what we still thought it was, out into the backyard. I said I'd stay with the Henshaws all night in case there were more, and proffered Lafayette, my Remington, to calm their spirits. In truth, I think I just did not want to be alone that night myself. The dead creature was inspected from afar by half the street. In the lamplight, he now just appeared to be a real filthy white man. In fact, now that I recall, we discovered a U.S. Navy tattoo on his right shoulder. Helen was calmer now, and by 9 she was getting quite tipsy, having drunk enough brandy to steady the nerves of a whole regiment. Leastways, we thought she had. When it transpired that she had barely swallowed a glassful, I could see Bill growing paler. When Dr. Bridges finally arrived to see to her, the bleeding had long stopped, but by now she was using language most unbefitting a gentle lady. She spat in the medical man's face and would not let him touch her further. Bill went to talk with the doc outside, leaving me with Helen. This next part I will never forget. She spent a long time breathing in a ragged croak, sitting up against the parlor wall, her hands crossed on her lap. Then, when she opened her eyes, they drifted around the room as though from a dream, and she glanced up at me. "Fire," she said. "Teeth. Fire teeth." She repeated this several more times as though checking the words over in her mind. I felt like a child in Sunday school trying to ascertain the meaning here. Her hair lolled round a spell, and then she began to drum at the wall with her elbow, softly and rhythmically at first, but soon with urgency and passion, all the while smiling broadly. I was now shouting at her to comport herself, and became aware that Bill had re-entered the room. He rushed to her side and held her arms together. She screamed at him and bit like a dog, snapping close to his face. He called out her name over and over, begging her to be still. She would not. I caught flashes of her eyes, panicked and wild. Not a shred of recognition for either of us. She tore and spat and writhed about, clearly in the grip of a fit of some kind. Dr. Bridges rushed in, holding a needle. It took some supreme effort for Bill to hold her arm steady long enough for it to go in. Her last screech sounded more like a wounded coyote than the woman I had waved to every morning for 15 years. I was crying. I found I could not stop, pleading with Helen to be still and wringing my hands. The doc and Bill got her upstairs and into bed, then set about clearing the room of all breakables. Bridges was muttering something about her being a danger to all around her. He could not know how right he was. We locked her in and retreated to the kitchen to tidy up and brew some coffee, dreading the possibility of further hysterics. Sure enough, within the hour, a bedlam was forming in the upstairs of the house. We heard hollering and crashing, and a pitiful high-pitched screaming that went on for an age. The neighbors once again came by, and we had to tell them that Helen was desperately ill and suffering from a delusional fever. They made polite but concerned noises about the spread of disease. It was when the bedroom fell silent that Bill straightened up and drained his mug. We shooed the gaggle of neighbors and made our way back up the stairs. Bill knocked and called out to Helen. There was a series of gasps from inside the room, and fearing her choking in some way, he unlocked and opened the door. The sight that greeted us will never leave me. The bed had been overturned. Bloody handprints lined the walls. Just the smell of blood and shit was enough to make me reel back. As I did so, I caught sight of Helen in the far corner. She was now entirely naked and crouched with her fingers to the ground and knees splayed out at angles. This is a familiar stance to the world now, I warrant. But in '72, the closest I had seen a creature assuming this state of quivering readiness had been a bobcat I once caught in mid-spring upon an unsuspecting rooster. Her hair hung loose around her face, her eyes enormous and blazing orange. It was so unsettling to see it then. I don't think I will ever find it commonplace, no matter how long we live with the ghoul. It was as though a tailor had removed the eyes of a feral creature and neatly sewn them into Helen's pretty face. Bill got 2 words out before she jumped. I had not brought my gun, 'cause frightening though she had been in her earlier state, none of us had thought that actually ending her life like a lame horse would have been on the cards here. We were entirely unprepared for how strong she would be, and how fast. Bill was unbalanced and fell against me. Dr. Bridges had gone to his kit bag, but as she barged me aside, the man crouched on the stairwell, busied with retrieving medical implements, must have proved too tempting to Helen, or what remained of her. Slamming him back against the banister with one hand, she sank her jaws into his cheek. Bridges had been momentarily stunned, but now screamed like a terrified child. Over and over she bit into his face, mauling him. Bill had picked himself up and now threw his body at the struggling pair. I could only watch helplessly as they tumbled down the staircase, a heaving mess of limbs and teeth. I crawled forwards and looked down, afraid of what I might see. The doctor lay groaning, the front doorway wide open. Bill was silent, and I could see neither hide nor hair of Helen. I gingerly made my way down the stairs, steeling myself against my natural revulsion to Bridges' ruined face. One eye had ruptured, and he was falling prey to spasms of shock. Bill lay quietly breathing. I inquired as to his state of mind and body. "She's gone," was all he would say. His collarbone had busted in the fall, and he expired before morning. By then the dark had already turned, and Helen Henshaw had spread her infection across half the town. Looking back, had I known then the danger all of us were in, I would by rights have put the bullet in her forehead and had done with the whole ordeal. But of course nobody knew. That was not how we dealt with the deranged. There was no call for it. Seeing what's happened to the country these years past, I can only guess that a similar handicap must have befallen many people during those first encounters, when appropriately practical action was so essential and so rarely applied. It is, plainly speaking, far harder to turn your mind swiftly to the thoughts of ending the life of someone in torment or in the grip of an aggressive spell, if that person is someone dear to you.
Maggie Strother gave this account of the Briars encampment, several miles north of Charlottesville, in the fall of 1877. 6 days later, it was overrun.
Private Henry Jackson, Fort McHenry, Baltimore, Maryland, March 15th, 1878. I don't know why they thought it was the niggers. They never did us any harm, and I didn't honestly see good cause why they would do any other. I just remember a lot of folks running around and shoving each other, hollering at the top of their voices. Lots of houses on fire, lots of screaming. My friend Bessie and I were getting real tired of playing soldiers and savages around the woods and down by the Mississippi, and we was starting to wonder what we'd do if we ever saw us a real one. We got real good at creeping round unnoticed, especially whenever the hollering started. Everybody was jumping at shadows and firing off shots. But if you knew the right places to hide, you always got a good view, and the bullets never came anywhere near you. So it's the late evening. We think about heading home, and we're watching this group of men march up the street. Judge McCade at the front. We was thinking, finally going to see us some savages running at them like we'd been told. But all they did was call in the Williams house and start hammering on their doors. There's more shouting and hollering, and Mr. Williams wasn't letting them in. It was his house, after all. Bessie was wondering if they wanted Mr. Williams to join them and go fight savages. The more the merrier. I said, there's no way old Judge McCabe would fight with a black man by his side. And suddenly, Mr. Williams is out the door and on the ground, and there's screaming going on. The men haul Mrs. Williams and Joshua, too, out into the front lawn. Mr. Williams gets pulled to his knees, and then in a trice, they're all lined up there. It got real quiet. We could hear Mrs. Williams crying, and Mr. Williams talking in a low voice to Judge McCabe. Then there was a shot, and Mrs. Williams just sort of fell down. I know now that she was dead, and they shot her in the back. But back then, I thought they'd crack her on the back of the head. I started getting up, but Bessie held me back. Mr. Williams was calling out to Joshua to run. Then there was a second shot, and Joshua was down on the ground, too. This was a boy we'd played at being smugglers with just the other week. I was livid. I couldn't tell if I was angrier or sadder. Mr. Williams was wailing by them. He just hunkered down next to his wife and kept crying, "No," over and over. Then the men shot him. Again and again and again. All of them just emptied their guns onto the whole family. The men of our shameful little town then burnt the bodies and went away. Over the next week, all the other black families that hadn't run already got the same treatment. Bessie and I didn't know what to do or where to go, because if big, proper men was acting like this, then who the hell's going to tell us straight and what's best to do? I still don't understand it. I don't think I want to. All I know is that now we're in uniform and folks will listen. Bessie and me tell the story to every single scout we meet. We hope it helps them not act like that. That's just plain loony.
Sergeant Bo Travis, Fort Livingstone, Louisiana, September 1st, 1872. I struggle to think of a poorer application of men and military force than I'm seeing right now. Our enemy is dug into our towns and farms, running riot in our cities, slaughtering our families and livestock. The hastily assembled units of soldiers, including myself, have been dispatched to the various standing Civil War forts to establish strongholds. This is a medical emergency, an epidemic, and needs to be treated as such. Our leaders are instead regarding this threat as akin to an attack by savages. Savages, I reminded my first lieutenant, do not inspire those whom they dispatch with a tomahawk blow to the head to get back up again within hours and go hunting for other civilized folk with their own tomahawk. We should be penning in the affected areas, containing them, quarantining the infected, surrounding them with watchtowers and refusing passage to all. Livingstone is a coastal fort. As I write this, I'm looking at an expanse of bayou. What I do not expect to see in a day now is a battalion of naval werewolves swimming towards our position to lay siege to us in the manner of Yankee soldiers. I'm going to appeal to the rest of the men and suggest we start sending out patrols to sweep the nearby areas. I suspect the ones in charge of us are not sure what is to be done, and I can make better use of myself attempting to restore comprehension than playing into their fairy tale of preparation. If my suggestions are not met with accordance, think no less of me, Isabel.
This was the last entry in Sergeant Travis's journal. His expedited court-martial and execution prompted an uprising that left Fort Livingstone empty of its garrison. The journal was founded in 1879 by RSA cartographers.
James Gregory, Manassas, Virginia, December 17th, 1876. I am unsure as to how I have come to be sitting here within the safety of city walls and able to sleep relatively soundly. I made it out of the hell on earth that New York City became, but to my shame, I must live with the knowledge that this hell was partly of my making. For 6 years I operated as a harbour master, and on the night of February the 6th, 1873, after hearing particularly distressing reports of new outbreaks down south, I had settled into another long night of monitoring the passage of inbound and outbound ships. The Hudson was at its most foggy and treacherous that night, and we were discouraging the approach of what vessels we could communicate with. One ship, an anchor-line cargo and passenger vessel named the Ishmaelia, was approaching at speed and would not respond to our hailing. I was attempting to prevent a wreck, so the swift organisation of guiding lights I had rigged up was done with only the purest of intentions. There were some 130 or so souls aboard, travelling all the way from Glasgow. They were several days late and coming in fast. It was my intention to save as many as possible. The Ishmaelia collided with the upper western dock, splintering wood and tearing metal. The sounds was deafening and abominable, likely awakening even the most accomplished of sleepers who lived close by the already noisy harbour. Its almighty frame continued its ingress upon our shores and tipped over at the starboard side, visibly spilling bodies as it went. Some went into the water, some clattered into the dock. My hand was to my face in horror at what I'd failed to prevent. I could scarcely breathe as the dock hands I had assembled drew in on the wreckage to possibly lend some aid to survivors. I knew the names of each and every one of these men. They were brave, strong, and despite their usually surly demeanour, possessing of the most generous of spirits. Not one of them deserved the treatment that transpired. The fallen bodies got up, moving with demonic lunges. The passengers and crew of the Ishmaelia fell upon my team, biting and clawing like rabid animals. More bodies had flung themselves from what remained of the ship, and they headed inland towards the city of Manhattan. None turned to look at me, or I would not be here writing this. As it turned out, there were 17 human survivors holed in the bridge. 12 of them were children. Their infected mothers and fathers had promised that they would not stay aboard the ship long enough to be a danger once they hit port. At the time, it must have been given with utmost sincerity. Thus began the sacking of New York City. The subsequent pandemic that precipitated the riots of 73, and the introduction of these creatures to the eastern coast. They were no longer confined to the southern states, and now America was held fast in an unholy pincer grip. Those fleeing from the south now found themselves heading directly into the jaws of this new infestation. If I do get to heaven, and I sincerely doubt that I will, I would like to ask God why he allowed this to happen. Even, depending on your view of his disposition, going to the trouble of orchestrating it himself. Is he testing our resolve to survive as people? Our ability to work together? Whatever his plan, my childlike view of him as a kindly benefactor has shifted somewhat.
James Gregory was stabbed to death in his bunk 3 days after this account was given. Additional for 1883.
Katherine Holloway, Weirwood, Charleston, West Virginia, October 9th, 1882.
After the war, in the southern states, we came to see our defeat at the hands of the Federal Union as one of numbers. There were simply too many opposing soldiers, and despite our military history, we could not prevail. To that end, all the aspects we held dear about the South, its history, the chivalry that these brave, dashing, uniformed men exhibited, and the romantic image of the sun setting on fields of cotton and tobacco after a day of hard toil, all these things seemed to have been lost, taken from us. I remember, specifically with the women, this great emptiness that rushed in to fill what once had been hope and jubilation. Our men were fighting for our way of life. We were exhibiting the same independence that had won America its freedom not yet 1 century before. So when scores of them did not return, and those that did came back frail, beaten, haggard by war, the light of defiance gone from their eyes or else snuffed by bitter defeat, it was a time of weeping until we could weep no more, until all was still and quiet, and the long night stretched on into utter uncertainty. I was a fierce and proud little thing in 62, still far from my 20th birthday. Every victory we had experienced elevated that pride still further, and in my mind I was set on my course. I would marry a handsome young soldier, an officer, and when the fighting was done and the Confederacy victorious, we would inherit the cotton plantation from my father and experience the grandeur of prosperity for all our days. The young soldier did indeed come my way. Lieutenant Preston Beauregard, with his flashing eyes and exaggerated bow. He made me laugh, and my heart flutter, and every moment spent with him in our gardens made me feel more of a lady and less of a child. I cared about dresses and looking as pretty as could be. To my mind, this equated to adulthood as aptly as a fellow in uniform fighting for his side of the country, distancing himself from the younger boys who were unable to. At the Battle of Wilson's Wharf in 64, Lieutenant Beauregard was brought down by Union fire, and that evening lost his right leg and 3 fingers on his left hand. He lived, but the man who returned to me was a ruin of his former glory. His face, scarred and gaunt. Those eyes, formerly dancing, now in near permanent repose. I did what so many other Southern ladies at the time were prone to do. I stood by him. The Yankees had taken so much from us that to let my resolve waver in the ugly face of cold consequence would have meant their victory over my soul. That August, we were married. I cannot say in looking back now whether my pride was diminished in this sad time or whether it burned all the fiercer, but I refused to break. And that resolve is why I am alive to write these words. The next year, my dear father took ill with rheumatic fever. It was May, a mere 2 days prior to the declaration of Union victory, that he passed away. West Virginia was a new state, only just separated from Virginia. It was also an area of land divided by ideology, and given to populations of near equal parts Union and Confederate soldiers. When the war was over, those who had offered shelter and comfort to the Confederacy were constitutionally disenfranchised, and the city of Wheeling had their rights to vote rescinded in order to maintain Union control. We had become pariahs in our own homes, simply for maintaining loyalty towards our people. The reclamation years throughout the next decade were bitter indeed, and over that period I grew hard and cold, older in spirit than I had ever foreseen myself becoming. I kept my house and my plantation, and no Yankees attempted to lay claim, but it was a punishing circus act maintaining that land, and what business I could muster with no father and a husband who would do nothing but sit and read, when not staring out of our drawing-room windows at nothing in particular. When the goblins reached the eastern states, I had become just about as hardy and shrewd as any woman you could care to mention. I call them goblins here because that is what they have been to us these past 7 years, and I see no reason to change that term for some textbook. You call them what you wish. Having survived on my own steam for this long, I saw no reason to panic and flee as so many others did. I assembled the staff who wished to stay, and we set about turning Weirwood Manor into a fortress. We ceased all aims of trade, and became entirely self-sustaining. I had not seen one yet, and my view on them was detached and indifferent. That June, when 7 of them stole into our garden, we went out to meet them as one would an encroachment of wolves, armed and ready. It was foolish overconfidence, and because of my hastiness 2 men died that night, though the goblins were dealt with and burned far from our perimeter. It was the day after that we began training in how to dispatch them. Even my darling Preston emerged from his catatonia to instruct us in combat. Over the following weeks he taught me all he had learned on the battlefield, including the regrettable hubris that had led to his dismemberment. By fall, we were taking in survivors from the nearby towns of Buckley and Clearwater, many of them children, their families shattered by this new disease. It became our remit to snap them out of their shock, their innocence, their naivety. We put them to work and expanded our vegetable fields, fishing teams, and hunting parties. I established a room full of seamstresses working through the day to repair and maintain clothing and materials. Our kitchen staff increased in size and output, our stable of livestock grew, and we had a good doctor to stymie any danger to our health and well-being. A school was set up to ensure that the youngsters' minds would be sharp, although the subjects taught, some by myself, pertained less to algebra and Latin vocabulary and more to the process of surviving each day. Some did not take well at first to the level of intensity this graft represented. In each case, I brought them down to my grand reception room and indicated our front doors as an alternative. Strangely, nobody ever opted for this. By winter, the house was full, and from that point on we had to turn away any more refugees. In 1878, a fellow approached the house to inquire about our situation. He was a twitchy sort and had a funny air about him. I made sure he left with as little information as possible about us. Were I given a do-over of that conversation, I would have answered his inquiries with a furious retort of lead. 2 days later, a crowd of men on horseback rode up and demanded that we give them room and board. They were armed and filthy, and looked like they were fixing for a skirmish. At their head was a smooth-talking fellow with a pencil moustache and a condescending tone. I refused him entry, and I believe it was my pride that saved my life. I am certain that had I stared into his eyes and wavered, had I not been coursing with cold, decisive fire, had I not been clad in a practical shirt and pants with my gun belt slung at my hip, that they would have ended me and taken everything we had. Instead, they retreated and slunk back in the dead of night to try and take it from us anyway. As the grandfather clock in the hallway outside my bedroom struck 1, Abigail Gray, one of my very favourite girls, quietly woke me. She was fully dressed and had bidden the others in her dormitory do the same, as had her friend James Penrose, a grave and steely-minded English boy who often assisted our doctor. They had spotted movement at our borders, having sat upon watch the whole night. Rather than creating a cacophony in an attempt to scare the interlopers away, I had my children take to the roofs to carefully and quietly mark their numbers. They weren't buffoons, I will give them that. These were professional raiders, clearly assembled from the rabble of angry, violent men who had decided their requirement for continuance outstripped the rest of America. Their type had ravaged several towns in the nearby area, but since 6 months had passed, I'd thought us free, that they had moved on. As it transpired, they were simply resting, living off their stolen goods, waiting until necessity would draw them to more violent extortion, theft, and murder. The main group was hanging back by the edge of the forest, waiting for some kind of signal from a team that was creeping around our walls. I decided then and there that if we were to be free of them, then the full attack must come. If we eliminated their spies, they would slink away and return again when hunger reminded them of their dire situation. We would not be ants to these grasshoppers. Every one of them must be eliminated. We lined up in the quiet watch teams that usually spotted and dispatched the goblins from our gardens. Meanwhile, in the house below, I had Abigail wake everybody else, with swift armament, even still clad in their pajamas. There were 42 of us, and after years of collaboration and effort put into maintaining this house, every one of us was ready to defend it with our last breath. I waited until one of the shadowy men down by my front step lit up a torch and began yipping in an uncanny imitation of a fox. I gave the word, and we left him alive, using bows to dispatch the rest of them silently. The black crowd of men by the forest had begun moving, and I spotted James creeping up behind the scout, who was only now beginning to suspect that he was alone. The two struggled briefly, and James survived, bearing the torch down the front approach to beckon our attackers further in the guise of their man. I knew that the moment we attacked there would be shots in all directions. Our recourse had to be one that would minimize damage to our house and ourselves. As they drew nearer, I counted over 60 out there in the dark. Abigail had taken everybody out the back and round the sides of the building, and using as much cover as we could possibly muster, we spread ourselves out until our lines were thin but defended. The rabble in front of us was clearly nervous, and as James extinguished the torch and darted into the orchard, I heard the unmistakable whispers of panic. I spotted Abby over by the stable, her downstairs dormitory team ready to fire. Our first volley had to be with arrows to ensure the quietest result with the most downed men. Silently, I had my rooftop group take aim, and sling 2 volleys of arrows in swift succession, numbering 24 in an arc through the night sky and down onto the raiders. The screams that arose as the first wave hit were our signal to press the attack. The group broke, and torches were lit. Shots did indeed ring out in all directions, and the front of the house was peppered something fierce. However, our 3rd volley was with rifles, and this was return fire of a degree they'd clearly not expected from some jumped-up farm girl schoolmistress and her troop of field workers and fishermen. The bulk of the group charged in towards us, and I realized we had not felled nearly as many as I'd hoped. Their panic was giving them leave to empty their weapons, and as they crossed the grounds, my children became exposed. This was a brutal and nightmarish affair. I spent the lion's share of it doling out orders from the rooftop, all the while wishing I could be on the ground, dispatching these accursed and ungentlemanly types for daring to despoil our land and harm us. They wished only to take what they needed to survive, but we made sure that this impulse was their undoing. James and a team on horseback chased down the fleeing remainder on my orders. Not one man was permitted to live, nor the women we found amongst their ranks. The danger of their continued existence, spreading the word of Weirwood, was simply too dire. I write of us now, in the solemn hope that our bloody retribution will take on a mythological status and inspire others to fight for what they grow. Although, admittedly, if they have survived long enough to hear this, then they have most likely had to do so already. When the cartographers showed up at my door, asking for trustworthy, brave, and clever individuals for their reunification, though it pained me to say it, and though years of entrenched bitterness left me indisposed on a personal level to their cause, Abigail and James were the 2 I put forward. If this is to be another war of numbers, I want the best and brightest in our ranks to guard us all from another far greater lost cause. 18 of our number died that night. They are buried in our grounds, along with everyone else we have lost over the years. This has been our existence, one of continual amendment of the requirements for survival. Its toll upon our bodies and souls is obvious. When the dawn broke that morning, and we accounted for the dead, I found my darling Preston propped up as though in sleep by the side of the cherry tree. It was a place we once sat in our former life, dreaming of the days when things would be still more bright and rosy. Beside him were 3 men, cut through the heart and neck. 3 men, including the arrogant leader himself, who lost a final battle to a crippled soldier with more bravery than they could ever comprehend.